Hello there, and welcome to the video on the core photography techniques that I'm creating. This video is meant to go over the rule of thirds, leading lines, and framing. These are three of the techniques that I see as being fundamental to anybody learning or doing photography. These techniques are not just beginner techniques, they're across the board. These are fundamental techniques that help make great photos. What this video is meant to do is to help you become introduced to each one of these concepts. Hopefully get you to start incorporating them into your photos a little bit more, make you start thinking about it a bit more. We'll go over each one of the techniques. There'll be some examples in the video, and then after the entire thing, I'll throw up some images in general. You'll be able to look at these and be like, oh, this shows rule of thirds, this shows leading lines, and then I'll give my explanations for why I think it does or does not follow these techniques. Again, these techniques are not mandatory for your photos. You can create great photos without using any of these techniques. However, these do help increase the aesthetic appeal of the photos that you are taking, and are just a great benchmark to help you get introduced to the project. Again, if you ever have any questions regarding this, please just feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to work you through the steps in a little bit more detail. So anyways, I'm going to go through each one of the techniques, beginning with the most critical one, in my opinion, to photography, which is the rule of thirds. Now, the rule of thirds, I will mention time and time again, is one of the most important things and one of the most prevalent things you will find in your photos. What the rule of thirds is that when you're flipping through your camera, you've probably come across this little grid that appears on your screen. 2 lines vertically, 2 lines horizontally. What this is that it's dividing your camera's display into thirds for you to see. And the reason this is important is that this is what the rule of thirds is based around. The rule of thirds is designed around taking images that place your subject matter on these vertical and horizontal lines, effectively placing your subject on a third of the image. Now, why would you say this is important? Well, the reason you want to put it on a third is because putting the photo on a third helps offset the image in a very appealing way. When you take a photo and you have your subject matter dead center, it's not necessarily a bad photo. However, it's not necessarily the most interesting photo you could possibly see. By offsetting your images, you can greatly enhance the quality of your image. As we see here, this guy, it's a good photo, but he's right in the center. It's pretty boring. Versus this next shot, it's a cat on a log. It's not necessarily exciting, but because the photographer offset that cat a little bit and put it on that grid, made that cat fall in that left third of the image, it really does help improve the image quite a bit. It helps draw your attention to that side of the image and makes so that there's not much, if any, wasted space in this shot. What you're trying to do is line your subject matter up on these lines, these vertical and horizontal lines. And by doing that, you're helping create an image that draws your user's attention across the entire shot. As we can see with this one, the bumblebee falls perfectly on that right third line. Obviously, the subject matter is on that right third line. Now, you might be saying that there's nothing in the far left side of this image, and that is completely correct. However, what you already have now is a very interesting image. If you look at this image, your vision will be taken from that blank, empty left all the way to that right rule of third, where you'll be drawn to that B, and that's what you're trying to do, is draw your user's attention to the subject matter on these lines. The second most critical part of the rule of thirds is utilizing the points of intersection between the vertical and horizontal lines. These intersections are where your user's attention or viewer's attention will be drawn to the most. In this case, it's being drawn to the bee's eye, which is what you would like, or the bee's head. Your subject is the bee. It's on the right third line. Now, your subject matter that is the most important, most interesting part of your image should fall on that point of intersection, which is the bee's head, which is most certainly the most interesting part of this photo. And that's what you're trying to do. Put your subject on one of the lines dividing into a third, and then put the most interesting part of the subject matter on the point of intersection. That is how you utilize the rule of thirds to create very outstanding images. Again, this doesn't need to be followed, but it does greatly help improve a mediocre photo to a better photo. This next image I have of this older gentleman, obviously, the man is on the right side of the image, and the majority of his body falls on that right third line. As you can look then, what's at the point of intersection? Well, his eye is basically at the point of intersection. As well, you can also tell that his tie and his flower are at the lower part of the intersection. So in this case, you can have two objects of interest that fall on these points of intersection or by the points of intersection. The critical part is that your subject matter is almost always on one of these lines dividing the image into thirds, and that with the subject matter, the most interesting part of it falls on the point of intersection for these images. Now, the second technique that we're going to cover are leading lines. And leading lines are a very interesting concept as they work usually against the rule of thirds, it seems. If you've ever seen a photo of a train track, you'll notice that your vision, or as you're observing the image, you will follow from where the tracks begin to you all the way to the end, to some focal point in the distance or to a bend. And that's what leading lines are supposed to do. It's supposed to help drag the user across the image to your subject matter. And by doing this, you help make use of the entire canvas space you're given with a photo. You want your user to look at all aspects of your photo usually, and that's what leading lines allows you to do. And the eye will naturally follow lines that are present in the image. Just looking at this track, it's, for all intents and purposes, a very boring image. However, what's happening, you're looking right where your eye begins in the lower left corner of the picture, and you are following it all around the photo. The photographer has been able to use a very simple image and very simple lines to help drag you across the entire image. Now, as you're noticing, not all these are following rule of thirds. Most of these are not following rule of thirds. The train tracks look straight down. This track and field court does not follow rule of thirds in the slightest. It's important to note that you don't need to use rule of thirds every time with every photo. It's just that the other techniques can also help greatly improve the image without requiring you to follow rule of thirds. Obviously, the spider web does utilize rule of thirds. That middle of the web is right on that third line and pretty close to that point of intersection. But again, it's not always a must to follow rule of thirds. It's just, it can really help improve your image in some instances. Now, in this image of the road, the most evident leading lines are the road itself. It's a very straight object. You have the edges of the road that are leading you down the horizon, or down the image, all the way to the end. Now, the one that you might not notice as much is the posts are creating a imaginary line. You're following each post individually all the way down and creating a mental line to the edge of the image. So in that sense, you're incorporating two leading lines into this shot. This next image of the house on the bay, very interesting shot, and at first you might be saying there are no leading lines present in this image. And that's a very easy thing to think. Leading lines usually aren't the most evident thing because they're not your subject matter. They're usually just something that's in the image is helping draw your attention to the subject matter. As you look at this for a while, you'll begin to notice the logs on the beach are actually your leading lines, helping draw your attention from the bottom of the image with the busy pebble beach all the way up the shot, which eventually drags your attention to the house. If you're also paying more attention to this image, you'll notice that the sky, the clouds are creating nice amounts of lines too that are dragging your attention from left to right across the image to that house. So leading lines can be used in multiple ways, as long as they usually tend to lead to the same subject matter each time. The next image that's going to pop up is of a canyon, which at first there's no logs, there's no clouds. This literally just looks like a landscape, and it appears as if there's not any leading lines. And then you start to look at this image for a while, and you begin to realize there's quite a few leading lines that are here, but you're not thinking of, which really encapsulates what a leading line is. Firstly, you have the canyon, the tops of the canyons. If you look at the upper left of the corner, your eye will be drawn down to about the middle of the shot where the canyons come together and the skyline ends. Very great leading line there. You'll also notice that if you look at the beach for a while, the pebbles, they lead from the bottom right corner of the shot all the way up to the mid left of the shot. Very, very creative way of using leading lines for this image and for this shot. What you'll think about with leading lines after a while is that there's many things that can be considered leading lines. Example of what could be leading lines that are man-made: fences, roads, obviously railroad tracks. What else could it be? Buildings. Buildings are a terrific example of leading lines. If you ever look at an old barn, it's all straight boards, or it's all brickwork that leads in a central direction. You can easily follow that to a subject matter at the end. What else could you consider leading lines? Well, trees. Trees are usually pretty straight, or at least straight enough that they work as a line. So if you follow that tree, you can find into a subject matter, whether it be an interesting leaf, a squirrel, a bird, etc. Rocks, as we've seen, waves, water, rivers. Anything that has the semblance of a line can easily be used as leading lines to help drag your attention to a subject matter. And so every time you're using leading lines, you need to remember what the core fundamentals of this technique are. Your lines aren't necessarily your subject matter. They can be, but that's not always the case. What you're trying to do is utilize these lines that are present in your image to drag your user's attention to a main subject matter that you want to identify. As we can see in this image, there's the edge of the road, and what it's doing is that no matter where you're looking, your attention is being dragged down that line and down those lines of shoes all the way back to the red shoes, and you're utilizing the lines to help bring your attention to the subject matter. The last technique we're going to look at today is framing, and I'll be completely honest, framing is one of the techniques that I think is one of the hardest to consciously think about, but it will be one of the techniques that you'll think, or that you'll realize ends up in your photos a lot more than you'd realize. What is framing? It's utilizing other objects to bring the attention, or by utilizing other objects to create a frame or to enclose your subject matter. In this sense, you're using the rock to frame the other rock formation out in the distance. You're trying to use other objects to help bring more attention to the object that you're photographing. The tree with the red foliage is being framed by this hole in another tree. You're utilizing something else to bring attention to something else by enclosing it within it. This is a very poor example, or this is a very poor explanation because it's something that's very hard for me to describe. Only because it's something that you'll just accidentally do. It really the point of framing is that it really helps minimize distractions in your image by blocking off sides or edges of your image and helping draw the attention towards this subject matter that you want to capture. Coming up, in this one at least, you're framing the ocean, and this is a very good example by using architecture to do so. This next image that we're going to look at, though, is one of framing that I really like, but it's not a very evident framing at first. As you'll notice, your subject is obviously the woman in white who's laughing, and when you look at it, there's not necessarily framing right away. However, when you look at it for a while, you'll notice that the gentleman on her right is very out of focus and not really part of the image, aside for the fact that he's really just blocking off that entire right side of the image. By doing this, you're really minimizing distractions in the shot and bringing the attention to the subject, who is the woman. And in that, you're encapsulating what framing is. Minimize distractions by using other objects to bring attention to your subject. If the man wasn't there or he wasn't focused, it'd be a much more busy shot and you wouldn't really notice the female as much, or it would take a lot more time for you to notice her. Here's a very clean cut example of framing. You have your nice woodland scenery outside, and you're framing that by using a literal window frame to do so. Obviously, all attention is on the scenery outside. Your attention is not on anything else besides that. This image of the two people in the arch, there's very interesting brickwork. However, what's happening? Your attention is being drawn down the tunnel to the people because they're framed by this tunnel. The final image we're looking at, though, is one that I find very interesting, and one of the examples that's a little bit easier to see how it comes up in day-to-day. Anyways, in this shot, we have kids playing croquet, and while there's no evident framing right away, you'll notice that the arch for the croquet hoop is drawing your attention inside of the hoop, no matter what you do. Your attention's not on the building outside, it's not on that ball, it's on the outside of the court. It's on the kid's mallet, and the other kid is about to hit his ball. This croquet hoop is helping draw your attention right to the subject matter. It's helping minimize the distractions outside, and even though it's not a very large frame, it's still helping draw your attention to the subject matter that you want to show to the viewer. Okay, so for the last part of the video, I just found a few images that I think exemplify these techniques pretty well. I'm going to put one of them on the screen, give you a few minutes to look at it, then I'll show you my logic behind it, like which techniques it showcases the best. Does it use rule of thirds? Does it not? Does it have framing? Does it not? Etc. So the first one we're going to throw up is this mountain goat. So take a few minutes, look at it, think about it. Does this follow rule of thirds? Is there framing in this shot? Etc. Okay, should be wrapping up pretty shortly now, so I'm just going to go ahead and flash what I think this image displays well. So I think this image does follow rule of thirds. Granted, the goat does not necessarily fall exactly on one of the lines, however, it is very close. I give a little bit of leeway with rule of thirds. I think as long as it's pretty close, you don't have to follow the grid exactly. The thing that really gives it away, though, is that that goat's head is right on that dot, basically. Falls right within the circle at that point of intersection. So I think this is a great example of rule of thirds. You could argue that this does showcase some framing. The reason I am lenient to say that it does have framing is that it's not really framing anything. The goat is right next to that frame, and there's nothing else that it's detracting from. So while it does potentially showcase framing, I think that's kind of a stretch. For sure, rule of thirds, framing could be argued, but more often than not, I'd like to see framing as covering, like if like the rock was coming a little bit out over the goat's head, or is sticking out more across the bottom of the shot, then I'd say it'd be more likely to be framing. At this point, it's a little bit iffy, but it could definitely be framing if you thought it was. Okay, next image then is this fence with a farm in the background, a beautiful blue sky, and kind of wintry. So look this shot over. Okay, you should be wrapping that up shortly, and on the screen now should be the rule of thirds grid with the photo. So first off, again, I think this does follow rule of thirds. Main reason for this, the horizon line is very close to that horizontal rule of thirds. Really helps draw your attention down to that part of the screen of the image instead of keeping your eyes up in the sky. As well, that farm is right in that point of intersection again. So another example of rule of thirds, in my opinion. If you said framing for this shot, you are most definitely correct. That farm is perfectly framed by those boards. Definite example of framing right here. Finally, I do think this also follows leading lines. These boards are going in straight lines, usually horizontally. Helps bring your eyesight down if you're following the horizontal boards to the horizon, which then leads to the farm. If you're following the boards vertically, eventually you will hit that one board that is sort of angled by the farm and helps frame it, which again brings your attention back to the farm. So this shot, perfect example of all three. Okay, next one. Another winter shot. This one I think is a caribou or an elk out in the tundra. So look this shot over. Okay, and now for what I think this shot exemplifies. Rule of thirds on this one, I am a little bit iffy. Granted, the elk is on that rule of third, however, it is not at that point of intersection. And even though it's pretty close, this is a little bit outside of that leeway I like to give it. Just because they could have easily moved themselves in this shot to get that elk on that point, so I'm assuming they weren't aiming to get rule of thirds. So this shot, not a rule of thirds shot. However, again, another good example of framing, using the little boxes of wire to capture that elk, caribou, whatever this is, very well inside of one of those squares. Again, not rule of thirds. Leading lines also applies. These lines from the fencing are leading you to that elk at all times, along with the mountain range leading you to the elk as well. So, leading lines, framing, yes. Rule of thirds, most likely not. Okay, to left. This one should be of a basketball hoop, or of a basketball going through a basketball hoop. So take a moment for this. And to show you the rule of thirds grid. Rule of thirds, not really. When you're this close to a subject, it's very hard to follow rule of thirds. The basketball does fall in that 1/3 line on the left, so I guess you could say it's rule of thirds. More so, I just like to say this is good composition on the part of the photographer, not necessarily use of rule of thirds. Framing, I think this does follow framing. The netting does provide, or acts in the same way that that croquet shot does. It does draw your attention inside of the net, which draws you to the ball, which is definitely your subject matter. Again, leading lines on this one are kind of hit or miss. The net, yes, it works as leading lines. The lines on the ball work as leading lines, so they're definitely present. It's not necessarily the strongest example of leading lines, but it is definitely present, and could definitely be argued that there are leading lines in this shot. The reason I'm thinking it's less leading lines is because your subject matter is so evident. The basketball is so present in this shot that you really don't need leading lines as much, and it's very hard to make them have as much of an impact as they would with a less noticeable subject, because your subject is the basketball. So framing is definitely evident. Leading lines slightly less so, but could definitely be there if you're thinking about it in a certain way. Rule of thirds not present. And our final photo is this city scene. Okay, so you should be wrapping up your inspection of the photo, and what do we think this is? I'm going to go with leading lines only. Even though the buildings are there, they're really not framing the middle part that well. There's just too much other stuff going on. The buildings aren't necessarily similar enough to be considered like being consistent frame. They're more so just part of the environment, so it's not framing. Rule of thirds, as we can see, not really present. In fact, this image kind of throws rule of thirds out the window and has your subject matter going right down the middle. This is one of those examples where breaking the rule of thirds can turn out to be an amazing image. You most certainly have leading lines present in this. You have just the cars in general are in straight lines because there's lanes on a road, and that follows you all the way back down the shot the entire way. You have the sides of the road leading you all the way down the shot the entire way. Excellent example of leading lines. Not so much of either other photography technique. In fact, I think both those aren't even present. So that'll conclude this video. Hopefully I'll get one more of these out soon. That video will be focused on how to take pictures of certain things, such as sports, animals, people, etc. So feel free to look out for that. Hopefully I'll get that out sooner than later, and please email with me any questions. Thank you.